Welcome you to tonight's CCL training. This is our weekly webinar program of Citizens Climate Lobby that provides CCL supporters like you with access to in-depth learning opportunities on topics related to climate change and effective climate advocacy. I'm your host tonight, Mindy Aller, and tonight's topic is transmission reform and key messages. I want to introduce our two speakers then for tonight. We have Jennifer Tyler, who serves as our Vice President of Government Affairs in Washington, D.C. And in this role, she works to advance the policy goals of CCL in Congress. And we also have Dana Nuccitelli, who is CCL's research manager and also an environmental scientist and climate journalist. And if we've done our job tonight, by the end, you will have learned about the political climate surrounding transmission reforms and key messages for each party. You will understand why transmission reforms are such a key climate solution. And we will also explore some specific transmission solutions that could be included in a comprehensive package. And we will have plenty of time tonight for Q&A. So we will use the Q&A feature that you will find at the bottom of your screen if you want to start putting questions in there in advance. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dana.
Thanks, Mindy. So we're going to start off with a little bit of the ground basis, why transmission is important. I like to think of transmission lines as the highway systems for our electrons, trying to get them from power stations to where people are. And if they get too jammed up, then you have all kinds of problems. And so it's very important. Those power generating facilities tend to be out in rural areas where there's affordable available land. And so you got to move those electrons around. And for our purposes as a climate organization, it's really important because most of the emissions reductions from permitting reform come from transmission reforms. And we'll talk about why in a little bit, but this is kind of probably the most important topic when it comes to permitting reform. And there's lots of benefits when you add transmission capacity. You make the grid more stable, you get better energy security and energy affordability, as we've talked about in some other trainings. Lots of experts recognize the importance of doing more transmission and permitting reform. For example, the National Academies of Science wrote a report on decarbonizing the United States a couple years ago. They said maybe the single greatest risk to a successful energy transition this decade is the risk that we fail to site, modernize, and build out the electrical grid. And the need for adding new transmission capacity during this decade is unprecedented, and the net result could be increased fossil fuels if we don't do that. So they recommended siting and permitting reforms. And just a couple weeks ago, Barclays, the financial group, came out with this sort of attempted to be a realistic take on the energy transition. They said electricity is becoming cleaner, but not materially larger within the energy system because we're having all of this power demand growth and growth in clean energy is meeting that, but we're not really replacing a lot of fossil fuels right now. And so the bottlenecks to doing that now lie in grids, permitting, in financing, and system integration, not in the cost of solar panels. Slow grid expansion, not technology cost, is the binding constraint on electrification. So transmission lines to get more clean energy on the grid, super, super important. And now I'll hand it over to Jen to talk about the political climate for transmission.
All right, thanks, Dana. Before I jump into the kind of historical context, I think Dana did a great job of teeing this up of just how important transmission is. And I know, this is a part of a series of permitting reform trainings we're doing. Hopefully, if you haven't attended the previous ones, you can go back and watch them, but we'll have others. But this one is so important because this is the crux of it for us. Permitting reform has a lot of important aspects, and each training will talk about a different aspect that we think is really critical. But this is by far the biggest one for the climate. And so this is the biggest one we focus on. It's also one of the most complex and kind of dense in terms of policy. And there's many different levels to this. Like all permitting reform, there's local, there's state, there's federal. So many of you will be aware of transmission projects in your backyard that are being talked about and grid reliability issues in your community. There's those local level and then it runs all the way up to the federal level. So This is one of the more, I think, dense topics, but Dana, I think, is going to do a great job of kind of breaking a lot of that more complex science and data behind it down for you all. But it's also one of the most important. So I hope this one is meaningful. We'll, of course, be talking about it a lot more beyond this training, but I just wanted to give the framing for this training, particularly transmission just being such an important topic because of how significant the climate impact is with this piece of permitting reform. So with that, let's talk about the historical context. So transmission for a long time was a word you probably would not have heard. Even, when I was on the Hill, when I started on the Hill, it was something we talked about, but it wasn't a big issue. Unless you were an energy staffer, you really didn't talk about it, hear much about it. For decades, transmission was really not a partisan issue. It was more of a technical issue. The utilities would come in, the grid operators would come in, they would tell Congress kind of what they need, what policy tweaks, what changes. That's the same way it would operate on the state level as well. So it was really driven kind of by the need, by the utilities, by what was happening on the ground. And the focus was really on that grid reliability, making sure that there was um, enough transmission to be reliable, to be stable. Also, that the technology of the grid was continuing to advance so that it was maintaining capacity and efficiency and being able to continue to run in different situations. And then it was for most of modern history really focused on fossil fuel generation, moving that fossil fuel energy sources from place to place, and that was because that was the cleanest source of energy. So that's what was, and now let's talk a little bit about what has changed. So for the first time in decades, electricity demand is rising really fast. And there's a few different factors. Of course, many of you are hearing a lot about data centers. That data center boom is driving a lot of this demand for electricity. There's also the electrification push on all different levels, how much we're electrifying things. That is also increasing demand for electricity. And then there has been a good amount of manufacturing reshoring, bringing that back to the US, and that is also driving up this demand. So electricity demand is rising very, very fast within the past few years. And then the other biggest piece, which is particularly relevant for us as a climate organization, is that wind and solar became the cheapest power source. And so that has really changed the game in terms of what type of energy would be moved through transmission. And Dana's going to talk a lot more about that, but that's really key here. And we talked about before, it was focused on moving fossil fuel. Now we're seeing wind and solar become a much bigger player. And so with Congress, what's changed? As I mentioned before, it was a nonpartisan issue. It was kind of just a technical thing that would come up. They'd make policy tweaks in different energy packages here and there, but there was not a huge discussion. There was not really much contentious debate on anything. But now, as we've seen this energy demand, electricity demand rise, we're seeing reliability concerns, all of these things, it's clear something has to be done on transmission. And with that discussion have come a few different pieces. First, there's this discussion of a federal backstop authority, which is basically this authority for FERC or other parts of the federal government to step in if states or local utilities are not doing what they should be, quote unquote, in the sense, approving new transmission projects, moving forward. The federal government can kind of step in and make sure that those things are going forward if they're in the best interest of the region or of the country. And then there's also cost sharing policies that talk about how do we pay for these new transmission lines? If we need to be sending more energy to different places, who's paying for them? How do states divvy up that cost? And so those two pieces, the federal backstop authority and the cost sharing policy, those have really become central to this discussion on transmission. And that's why I said it's a technical kind of wonky topic because there's so much variability in how you craft transmission policy. But those two pieces being really, really important. And those pieces also generate a lot of concern with Republicans. From a federalism concern of the federal government stepping in a way that Republicans feel not very comfortable with, and also the cost sharing point of our states going to be sharing this burden when they feel they should not be. And so there are those concerns coming up on the Republican side of the aisle with transmission policy. The second piece that's really changed with Congress is that this data center boom and this drive, this demand for electricity has really opened everyone's eyes to the need for more capacity. So everyone now, as I mentioned, is seeing we have to do something on transmission reform. So where do things stand now? Well, as you can kind of glean probably from what I'm saying, is some resistance on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, this is a top priority because this is the top climate impact, because this is so important for reliability, for affordability, all of that. Transmission is really a top priority on the Democratic side, and there's not going to be a bipartisan permitting reform bill, comprehensive permitting reform bill, if it doesn't have transmission, because that is really the top ask alongside certainty. But transmission has been historically the top ask for Democratic members of Congress. On the Republican side, there is that resistance about that federal backstop authority as well as cost sharing, but the resistance has really softened, and that's because of the recognition that this has to happen because there are those concerns about reliability and consumer costs right now when it comes to energy, and Republicans and Democrats want to have an answer to that. How are they keeping costs down? And then there's also this increased power demand from data centers and manufacturing. And so Republicans also recognize they have to do something on this. So there still is some concern, but it's definitely softened a good bit. And so I mentioned some of these before, but these are the real core tension points within transmission policy. That federal backstop authority, again, that's the federal government being able to step in and kind of force a state's hand, force a region's hand if they're not moving forward on transmission projects the way they should be. Cost allocation, which state, which region is paying for a project, especially if these long transmission lines, they're running across regions, who's paying? Is it the people on the front end, the people receiving the power, the people in the middle? How do you divvy up that expense? Local land use opposition, as you can imagine, these long lines running through local land, and whether that's private owners or state and local lands, concern about where those transmission lines are placed. Incumbent power plant revenue loss. So thinking right now, we're sending fossil fuel energy through these transmission lines. And so as you bring on new energy, which is going to be predominantly cleaner energy because that's the cheaper energy source, that's going to displace some of this kind of original pre-existing energy. And so there is this concern that some industry, fossil fuel industry, has about displacing some of their existing power plant energy that's already online. And then there has been this, green energy subsidy narrative, which obviously transmission policy is not a subsidy, but the fact that this is going to significantly benefit clean energy, green energy, there are sometimes folks on the far right predominantly who will say, transmission policy is just a handout to solar and wind. Which it's not. It's obviously meant to, boost our transmission and affordability, reliability of all energy, but because of the fact that solar and wind is much more competitive now, that will obviously be benefiting significantly. So those are some of the tension points, but I'll turn it back over to Dana, who will walk through a bit more of this in detail.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Let's talk about some challenges and policy solutions when it comes to transmission. So we're trying to solve a bunch of problems. We're trying to add more cheap, clean energy to the grid. We're trying to share it across the country. That takes more transmission lines. We're also seeing more of these climate exacerbated extreme weather events. Those are causing more blackouts. So if you can expand transmission, you can help solve that problem too, as we'll talk about. And we have a lot of regions of the country that have very little connections with transmission lines to their neighbors. There's actually a good report that's updated periodically on this from Americans for a Clean Energy Grid and Grid Strategies. You can see on the top here, it's their 2023 grades for regions, transmission planning and development, and on the bottom is their most recent one they just published for 2025. So you can see there's a lot of pretty bad grades. Some of them are improving, like California's doing okay because we've got some good planning here in my state, and also we're kind of trying to do more interregional transmission with the rest of the West, and so that's improving the rest of the West a little bit, but that's pretty lacking. Texas has kind of got their own thing. They've got good in-state transmission, but they don't want to connect to the rest of the country because they like to be kind of isolated and have independence there. MISO, we're going to talk about in sort of the Midwestern part of the country, has been really good in terms of building more transmission lines. The Southeast, they gave an F on every single category, so the Southeast needs to do a lot to improve their transmission planning and development, and the Northeast has improved lately in doing some good planning and also doing some connections to Canada. So, you can see things are improving a little bit, but we still got a long ways to go in improving our transmission planning and development to solve some of these problems. And again, as Jen talked about, we've got this growing power demand. We've got electrification of transportation cars, of buildings with heat pumps and so on and so forth. We got data centers, especially with AI development, adding all this demand. And so we just need more transmission to connect more power generation. And that is true of any type of power. It's the main reason it mostly benefits clean energy is because clean energy is cheap and it's fast to build. And so that is most of what we're building, as we've talked about lots of times. Like over 90% of what we're adding to the grid now is clean energy. And so that is what benefits the most when you build more transmission that can handle more energy. But if you're building natural gas, nuclear power, whatever it is, like it still needs transmission. So any type of power benefits from more transmission. And as we have this rising demand, it's going to keep rising over time. And so there's a bunch of analyses you can see in this chart on the right showing that we're going to need to at least double our transmission capacity by 2050. This chart's from a nice paper that was just published a couple weeks ago. Kind of took together a whole bunch of different reports and different scenarios. You can see as we move to the right, that is scenarios projecting higher total power demand and power generation in 2050. And as we move up on the chart, that is having higher transmission capacity in 2050. So, not surprisingly, as you need more power generation, you need more transmission. And so most projections have us somewhere in this range of roughly a doubling or tripling or maybe quadrupling of power demand and pretty similar doubling, tripling, or quadrupling of transmission capacity, but probably in this doubling to tripling range. Regardless, point is we need more. We got growing power demand. We're going to need more power generation. It means we're going to need a lot more transmission lines. So policy solutions, the kind of interesting stuff that we're most interested in learning about. Jen talked about the federal backstop authority. The idea there is that if you're doing a big interstate transmission line, you have to get permits in each individual state you're going through. That can take a long time. And so the idea is if states are taking more than a year or so to do the permits, then if it's a really important transmission line, then it goes over to FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they say, we're going to be the one-stop shop for the permitting. We'll take over the whole paperwork permitting process. We will coordinate with the states, but we're going to be doing it. So that reduces sort of red tape and paperwork and so forth and makes the whole process more efficient. That's something that Congress has been trying to expedite for like 20 years and has so far not succeeded. So the idea is to try to get that to succeed now. We could have a interregional transmission planning authority in some federal agency. It's that because the grid is kind of segmented into these regional grid operators, and nobody's doing like national grid planning, which would be kind of a smart thing to do for a country that wants to have like a coherent, functional national grid. Jen talked about cost allocation. That's a hairy topic because, nobody wants to pay for more than, they're going to benefit from a new transmission line. So, and there's often fights over who's going to pay for how much. And so that adds a lot of time. To avoid that, you want to standardize a cost allocation approach where you figure out like what are the benefits from a transmission line and then who's going to get those benefits and then allocate the costs proportionally so you're only paying your fair share for each transmission line. So setting up some kind of standardized approach is something that people are trying to do in permitting reform. With these transmission lines, often they trigger various laws and reviews in different federal agencies. And so a smart thing to do is just to say, FERC, you're going to be the lead agency for all transmission lines, and other federal agencies that are involved can coordinate with FERC, but then it's just kind of under FERC's umbrella and it kind of makes the process more efficient. We can create more categorical exclusions for example, if we're upgrading existing transmission lines with new technologies, with new sensors, with new lines, that's not having a big environmental impact because the towers are already there. And so that probably doesn't need a super thorough environmental review because you're just kind of applying new technologies to existing infrastructure. And so if you can do a categorical exclusion for that, then we can do that much more quickly and much more efficiently. Relatedly, those are grid enhancing technologies are ways to kind of add technologies to existing power lines to make them operate more efficiently and at a better capacity. But right now, there's not much financial incentives for a lot of grid operators and utilities to apply those. They don't get a lot of, like, if you're an investor-owned utility, you don't get profits for that. You get profits for like building new infrastructure, but not for upgrading existing infrastructure. And so we could, in some way, incentivize grid enhancing technologies so we can better utilize our existing infrastructure. And something that's not going to happen anytime soon because Congress is kind of anti-tax credit right now. But in theory, we could have a tax credit for new transmission lines. That is something that was taken out of the Inflation Reduction Act. We also lost a lot of the other tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act, so we're not going to expect new transmission tax credits to be applied, but that is at some point something that we could do to incentivize more transmission lines. It's worth noting that a lot of these things aren't exactly permitting reforms, but they get wrapped up in the permitting reform umbrella because, we're just essentially transmission is very important for our power system. And so this is kind of the place that we apply all these ideas in a permitting reform package, even though you might say like that is not permitting at all, but it's related because it's trying to upgrade our infrastructure. So one area that we have already advocated here is with the Big Wires Act. You guys might remember from a few years ago. The idea there was to have Congress tell FERC to tell transmission planning regions, except for Texas, because Texas likes to do their own thing, to increase their capacity to transfer electricity with their neighboring regions to something like 30% of their peak demand. So that was something we advocated for. That was something there was a lot of research showing lots of benefits of that for energy affordability and security and reducing blackouts and things like that. And there was just 2 weeks ago a nice paper published showing that that kind of thing, adding transmission between regions, interregional transmission, would have some really good financial economic benefits. One tricky thing is that if you're building a big, long, important transmission line, it's a pretty expensive thing. It costs billions of dollars to build. But this study found that if you were to do that, they would save in the ballpark of $5 billion per year nationwide from having more of this interregional transmission, because then you can, again, build more cheap, clean electricity. You can transport that around the country, so lots of different regions can benefit from that cheap, clean electricity. This study also didn't even include the benefits of reducing power outages, because if you're connecting different regions, then if your region has a power outage, but you're connected to another region that has extra electricity, you can bring that in and reduce power outages, which has big economic benefits because power outages are very bad for the economy. They really mess up our economic productivity, and so it didn't even include those benefits. However, it did find, as Jen mentioned, that this is going to cause some power plants to lose revenue. In this chart on the bottom right here, it's the ones that are yellow and red would lose revenue. The ones that are green would gain revenue. So basically, you can see like in the middle of the country where we have lots of cheap wind, especially and cheap resources, then you're sharing that across the country to the coasts. So those power plants in the middle of the country that have this cheap electricity that they can sell now to the coasts, they're benefiting. Whereas if you have an expensive power plant along the coasts and then you're importing competing cheap electricity, then you're going to lose some revenue. So just worth bearing in mind that those are going to be some opponents potentially to interregional transmission, although there are also some power plants that are going to be proponents. So got some interesting lobbying that could happen there too. And putting this all together, if you account for the costs of building a new transmission line, all those benefits of building more clean and sharing more cheap, clean electricity, there was also a nice study just published a few weeks ago that brought together a bunch of different studies looking at the cost to benefit ratio. And so basically what they found was that anything above 1 means that the benefits exceed the costs, and so you're saving money. You can see these are all above 1. There's some uncertainty as to exactly how much the benefits to cost ratio is, because it depends on the region and the specific details and assumptions and things like that. But roughly estimate is that the economic benefits of a big new interregional transmission line exceeds the cost by 1.5 to 3 times, something like that. So you're definitely saving money, even though it is an upfront cost, because of all this sharing of cheap, clean electricity and improving of energy security as well. So, big question for us, of course, coming back to the climate question is how much is it going to reduce climate pollution? And our best example here was in the Energy Permitting Reform Act, EPRA, from a year and a half ago or so, which had a bunch of different provisions in there. And then so Third Way brought in a bunch of expert modeling groups and had them model what these provisions would do. And they had RMI model the transmission provisions. And so the challenge here is that we have these transmission permitting reforms that will allow transmission operators to build lines faster. But then there's a question of how fast they would actually build them, because there's some constraints that will probably prevent them from building transmission lines as fast as possible. For example, there's a lot of stakeholders involved that can slow things down. Some regions would worry about building transmission lines too fast because, again, that is a big cost. And if you impose this big cost and you don't use it right away, then you're incurring costs on your local ratepayers. And so there's a challenge there. And so the assumption that RMI made, they looked at MISO that I mentioned in kind of the middle of the country that has been building transmission lines really fast. And they said, okay, that's kind of like our upper limit. They're going really fast. They're being very ambitious. Other regions aren't going to be so ambitious. So we'll assume that on the average, regional grid operators around the country will build transmission lines about half as fast as MISO did. So they assumed that if we do that assumption, then what would happen is that our transmission growth, the amount of transmission lines we're building each year, would grow by about a factor of 2 to 4, which is a nice speeding up of the rate of our currently very slow transmission build-outs. That would be enough for a scenario where we have lots of new renewables, lots of clean energy, and moderate growth in our power demand, in our power supply. So it's kind of a middle of the road scenario. So it's fairly conservative. It could certainly go faster than that, but it's a reasonable assumption. And they also assumed that these regions, these regional planning grid operators would build about 20% of interregional transfer capacity, 20% of their peak load that they could transfer from their neighbors. So it's less than big wires would have mandated, for example. And then research also showed that the 30% in the big wires is economically optimal, or maybe even more than 30%. So that's kind of conservative, thinking that like they would probably be better off if they built more like 30%, but because of various constraints, people being people, maybe they'll only do 20%. So that's a pretty conservative assumption. And then they assumed that our power demand growth will increase to be double what it is today in 2050, which again, that's pretty reasonable, kind of middle of the road. If you look at the net zero America, where we're trying to get to zero emissions by 2050, they found that transmission capacity we have to double to quadruple. So it's kind of on the low end, but it's kind of a reasonable, like, middle scenario. But I bring this up to say that we could do certainly a lot better. We could build a lot more transmission than in this scenario. We could build a lot more clean energy than this scenario if we get very ambitious. But, they're basically trying to factor in human constraints there. So then they came up with this formula because we're trying to figure out if you build transmission, how much is that going to reduce emissions? So they say, well, you're going to add X amount of transmission miles. And again, they said we're going to assume that we're going to build nationwide half as fast as MISO is building right now. So conservative, safe assumption. And then if you build new transmission, that's going to allow you to connect a certain amount of clean energy to the grid. So they kind of looked at how much we're adding to the grid in terms of power generation per amount of transmission. That's that number. And they said if you're building new clean energy, that is going to mean you're building less natural gas. Because basically what we're building right now is solar, wind, and gas, and a little bit of other stuff, but almost everything right now is solar, wind, and gas. And so if you're building more solar and wind, that means you're building less gas, and so you're avoiding those emissions. And so they put that all together. That's their formula for figuring out how much is a segment of transmission line going to reduce emissions. So then I said, okay, let's say we build this amount of transmission lines. In this chart, it kind of goes up over time. That's your cumulative new transmission lines between now and 2050. And they said, okay, we're going to build some of that regardless. Even if there is no permitting reform or transmission reform, we're going to build some amount of transmission. So they said, okay, and within a region, we are building some transmission, like MISO's building a bunch. There's different regions that are building a bunch. So let's say they build 30% more by 2050 because of it's easier because of of permitting reforms. So that I call kind of an educated assumption. Like it's a reasonable number. It's a very hard number to come up with because again, you're trying to predict human behavior and constraints and things like that. But that's kind of the assumption they put in there. 30% more transmission build out because of permitting reform and within regions, and then interregional between regions. Right now, we're building almost no interregional transmission. There's just not a financial incentive for grid operators to connect to their neighbors because then you're introducing competition. Who likes competition? And so they said we're going to give 100% of the credit for any new interregional transmission that we build to permitting reform and things that FERC does. And so that's how they came up with it. Here, we're going to build this much new transmission, this much credit goes to permitting reform, and that translates into your, certain amount of emissions reductions. And the number they came up with was central estimate 6.5 billion tons of emissions reduced between today and 2050, which is roughly an 8 to 22% cut in emissions in their kind of range of possibilities. So very significant cuts in our cumulative emissions over the next 25 years or so. So one question I had was that like this analysis was done, during EPRA days before the last election, before, the one big budget bill was passed. Does the analysis still hold when, for example, we don't have a lot of those tax credits in place anymore? And so I talked to Chas Teplin, who is at RMI. He was the lead author of that analysis of EPRA, and I said, "What do you think? Do your assumptions still hold?" And he said, "We basically assume that wind and solar are going to have the financial and policy outlook over the next 25 years necessary to want to build and fill up any new transmission capacity. So if that is still true over the next 25 years, then the analysis still holds." And I think pretty safe to assume that those assumptions still hold because we are seeing this rapidly growing power demand. So that's not going away. We know there's going to be lots of demand. If we build new transmission to help meet that demand, the new power we're going to build, we know it's going to be vastly, like mostly solar, some wind. There's going to be some gas, but then over time, there's also going to be like more geothermal, more nuclear. And so most of it is going to be clean energy. And so I think it's safe to assume, like, if we build more transmission, we're going to fill it up with new power to meet all this growing demand. And the vast majority of that is going to be clean. And so the analysis still holds. And so, given that, looking at these numbers, we've talked about this in a couple of previous trainings, but from the Inflation Reduction Act, we were projected to reduce emissions by about 7 billion tons by 2035. After the one big budget bill rolled back a lot of those tax credits, well, we lost about 6 billion tons of that, left with about 1 billion tons of emissions reduced by 2035. And then, according to this analysis of these transmission reforms in EPRA by RMI, which we're probably going to see very similar provisions in any kind of permitting reform bill going forward. Then you get 6.5 billion tons or so by 2050. And so it's basically equivalent to restoring the Inflation Reduction Act, maybe doing better if we get more ambitious with our transmission build out. But in any case, permitting reform is the big climate policy, and transmission is the big climate policy in permitting reform. So very, very important. Kind of this is why CCL is so focused on it, because it's the big climate policy right now. So now I'm gonna hand it back to Jen to talk about key messages for different political parties.
All right, awesome. That was all such good info. And if you're not as data inclined as same with me, it might take a couple read throughs to pick up a lot of that stuff. But also I want to everyone to feel rest assured. Obviously, when we go into a lobby day, you guys will be prepared with all the data you need spelled out. So don't feel like you have to memorize any of this. But I think those points are just helpful for us to have in our own mind to kind of frame why we're working on this and to start picking out some of these messages that are relevant to different members of Congress. So we'll start with Republican offices. And again, we're going to have before lobby days, we'll have really tight, specific messaging. But I want to frame this issue of transmission for you all. So when you think of approaching your Republican member of Congress, or maybe you're operating in an area that has more Republican folks on the ground, you're tabling, you've got neighbors, you've got family members you want to talk to about this issue. These are some of the points you want to lead with Republicans. Grid reliability, making sure that the grid is stable, that we can withstand extreme weather events, that we're continuing to get energy where it needs to go. Energy dominance, we've talked about this point a little bit with carbon border adjustment mechanisms and different pieces of energy policy, but really making sure that America is able to compete. Our American energy sources, our American energy, in this case, transmission is really top notch, is able to really be as strong and solid as it can be. Economic competitiveness. So obviously, without energy getting where it needs to go, we're not going to be able to have the manufacturing online where it needs to be, or these new data centers in this case. We're not going to be able to kind of compete on that economic level that we need to compete as a country. The other piece of that, in addition to kind of the business side of things, is the human side. It's their constituents, it's their neighbors, and that's the affordability and lowering consumer costs point. And we're hearing that when members talk about healthcare, talk about food in the grocery stores, but energy is becoming a huge, huge part of that affordability discussion. So that really we probably should have put higher on the list. I should have. I really think that's one of the key pieces there is we want to make sure energy is affordable, and in order to do that, we have to have transmission policy. We have to have new transmission lines come being built. And lastly, I kind of touched on this a little bit, but the energy supply for domestic manufacturing and data centers. So just talking about the businesses that need to connect, talking about that increased demand for electricity. That's something that Republicans are pretty receptive to. For all Republican offices and for your Republican friends or neighbors, I would avoid the climate angle. It's obviously, we're not hiding the fact that that's why we care about it, but that's not what's going to resonate with them. So really focusing on some of these bullets that you think are really going to connect with them that also might resonate with you, that you can broach with them might make you a little more successful in that conversation. For Democratic offices, on the other hand, we're not trying to persuade them. They're already supportive of transmission policy. Again, that's their top priority. So we don't have to sell them on the need to do this, but we do have to stress the urgency. So for that, we really want to emphasize some pieces to make sure they understand that not just is transmission urgent, but because transmission is urgent, we then have to do a comprehensive permitting reform package because we're not going to get a standalone transmission package through. This is going to be a piece of a comprehensive package. So we really want to stress to them how important it is that this moves and it moves now. The top bullet is the biggest one. Transmission is the backbone of climate progress. Dana gave you a lot of great points to highlight and numbers to pull out there of just how much emissions reductions can be met, how significant that impact would be from a climate perspective. That's going to be the top point for all Democrats on this topic. Restoring emissions reductions that were lost in the IRA rollback, really just trying to kind of offset as much of that as we can. Again, looking through some of those data points of how much emissions reductions would be met by this. Reliability and lowering consumer costs. Those are 2 points I mentioned with Republicans, but those are just as salient right now with Democrats. These are political hot button issues. We're in an election year, so these are things they're thinking about. These are things they're hearing about from their constituents. And so keeping the lights on, keeping the power coming to their house, no matter the weather outside, and making sure that people aren't paying crazy amounts of money for their power is super important. So that's also a point that you can bring up with Democrats as well. And then the last one, keeping the clean energy transition on track. We've obviously had a number of setbacks with this current administration rolling things back, this Congress rolling things back that were benefiting the clean energy transition. This is one huge policy we can do to boost and increase and make sure that clean energy transition continues to go ahead. So it's kind of a bright spot and area of progress that we can play offense on instead of playing defense on in the clean energy arena. So those are some of the key messages that we've got. But of course, we'll go over in more detail before lobby day. But it gives you a way to start thinking about this and think about the member you typically work with. Think about the people in your community you'd like to connect with and what pieces of this stick out to you that might resonate with them. So these are our upcoming permitting reform trainings. We've got the Build Faster one focusing on some NEPA reforms, Thursday, March 19th. fair permitting certainty, which is going to be another huge piece of this conversation for us on permitting reform, making sure that permitting is a certain process and there's guardrails in place so that administrations can't take actions they shouldn't be taking on different permits. That's Thursday, April 2nd. Community engagement, another important piece that we've advocated for a long time, making sure that people can be heard early and often in the process, Thursday, May 7th. And then we'll do a recap one where we just talk, maybe not recap, it's more diving into those messages. So instead of going as deep into the data and some of the background information, really that last one, May 28th, we're going to sum up how do we talk about this? What are the messages on permitting reform broadly to each side? How do we weave in some of these specifics on transmission or on certainty or community engagement, depending on our office, depending on our audience? So I think that last one will be really helpful. But with that, I will turn things over to Mindy.
Well, thank you both, Jenn and Dana. We have come to the top of the hour. I will put the link to log your training into the chat one more time. Thank you all for being with us here tonight, and join us again next week for the next installment of our CCL training. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.
Good night, everybody. And,
Take care.
thanks, Jenn
That was great.
And Mindy. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.